What is that? It's the most widely known curve in audio. dB, frequency, it's the frequency response curve. Usually the frequency response curve might be in the round of, 70 to dB. Usually in hi-fi rooms, there's a lot of up and down in the bass, and it levels off in the treble. And but the frequency response curve covers up something. If we could peek underneath it, we would see this. What's that? It's the background noise floor. And if we could peek inside of there, we would see one other noise floor, which is called the self-induced noise floor. Now that's my language for it, but that's what it is anyway. It is self-induced noise floor. In other words, this curve does not stimulate this noise. That's just a bandwidth that exists because it's there. This curve stimulates another curve, which is a self-induced noise floor, and it's, varying between, 10, 35, whatever, dB below the frequency response curve. This is the curve that we want to look at. And in amps, in the world of amps and speakers, this is harmonic distortion. Total harmonic distortion. And they've got special equipment that they use, analyzers, it's not what you use to get this, it's what you use to get that. On the other side of at the face of the speaker, the electronic world ends, and the last link in the audio chain is the audio room, hi-fi room. And now we have a launch a perfect signal into the room, but what gets to the end of the room and the listener is not always perfect, mostly not perfect. And so, but there is an acoustic version of this also, and this is called the running reverb. In other words, if you turn the sound off at any instant of time, the sound level would drop and you would hear the running reverb. And if you then played it again for a while and then turned it off again, you would hear the running reverb. So the running reverb is a self-induced noise floor, and it's the acoustic running reverb, because remember, we're not talking about what a microphone hears. Well, it is what the microphone hears. And but what the listener is the one that's suffering, okay? Because if the running reverb is too loud, if the running reverb is too loud, the music sounds dynamically blurred in this frequency range. In other words, instead of bop, 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 it goes bop, 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 bop. If we're doing testing that, we're using if we're just putting little tone bursts in the room and doing a frequency sweep, that's called a gated frequency sweep. Bop, 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 bop. That's gated frequency sweep. Okay. What's curious, and let's talk about it for a little bit, is in the world of amps and speakers, they have a frequency response curve and a noise floor, and they have this curve in here, harmonic distortion, and they use two ways to get it: a frequency sweep or a multitone. Now, frequency sweep goes boop, and then it listens for the harmonics that are generated at any of these frequencies. The multitone hits the equipment with a series of tone bursts, all at the same time in different frequencies. So this is a burst, this is a burst, this is a burst and burst. And what it gets is in between the bursts, it gets the noise floor. And so this is the frequency response curve, and you can't see this, and you can't see this because that's the noise being applied to the room. But in between, you see the hidden harmonic distortion levels. And in the room acoustic version, we had a chopped frequency, bop, 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 which is kind of it's a combination of frequency sweep and multitone. And it's a way of getting multitone, but you can't get all the tones at the same time. And so this is spread out over time. So we have a bop, 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 and then in between we go bop, and then how loud. Remember, this note sounds just like this note. This sound comes from that sound if we're doing a sweep. And then this sound is played and we hear it nice. And then we hear this sound in between this sound and this sound, because it's a time. This is a sweep over time. So it's a frequency sweep over time, and it's dB. But so time and frequency are connected together. This is low and this is high. So that's a gated frequency sweep. And it combines that one and multitone and frequency sweep concepts and testing methods all in one, which is the gated frequency sweep. Now, the gating rate is an important thing. It turns out that people all over the world average of people-made sound, speech, music, drum beatings, whatever, is the fastest, is 8 separate sounds per second, 8 separate sonic events per second. And so if we use a gated tone burst that is 8 bursts, here's a burst, 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 whatever, here's a burst. If we'd used 8 bursts per second, we would be testing the room at a burst rate that is the fastest burst rate average worldwide that humans make. And so that's a pretty reasonable speed to be testing the room for music and speech. And so that's now the test looks like dB time. Nothing. Then all of a sudden the sound gets loud. Boop, 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 boop. And then, in the mat test, which is what we came up with, it goes back down again. Bop, 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 blah. Okay, and this starts at 20, peaks at 780 hertz, and drops down to 20 again. It takes 90 seconds to run that test. Each tone burst is 2 hertz apart. So if this is 20, this is 22, this is 24, this is 26. Each test is 2 hertz apart, and on the sweep. So time and frequency are proportional. So if we wait it's 8 bursts per second. So every second we have 8 bursts, and the tone changes 16 hertz. Here, let's say this is 8 bursts, and the tone changes 16 hertz. And this is 1 second. So the tone changes 16 hertz per second. Anyway, that's the burst rate. And so the signal looks like that going to the equipment. What it comes out at the listening position is something that looks like this. Usually it's pretty good in the middle, and then it gets skinly and goes like that in the low frequencies. So if you draw a line to the upper part of that curve, that's how loud the sound got during each tone burst. And that's the frequency response curve. If you draw another line through the bottom of that curve, that's the induced noise floor. And the difference between them is the modulation. In other words, how much the sound level changed between between the noise floor, between the tone and the noise floor. So this is the modulation. Okay, so that's what the tests in a room look like. Now, modulation. We're using a modulated signal that's 8 bursts a second. It turns out that the maximum modulation that a human can hear is 20 dB. And that's at 8 hertz. This is zero modulation, steady tone. 2 dB modulation. And so this is kind of like 0 and 100% modulation. So between 80 and 100, it sounds like everything sounds like it's 20 dB. But down in the lower modulation rates, if the modulation, remember it's boop, noise, boop, less noise, boop, more noise, boop, less noise. So if the modulation, which is the signal, this many dB, if that is small, then we can hear the ratio is linear. But as it gets about 7 dB, it starts rolling off. The human can only hear. So if we applied a modulation that's 30 dB, the human only thinks it's 20 dB. They can't tell the difference. So there's no sense testing the room for more than 20 dB modulation because that's the maximum a person can hear. Okay. So let's take a look at what the tone bursts look like. So here's a tone burst, and then it's supposed to be quiet. Okay, so there's no signal. Let's do the next one. So that would be silent, loud tone burst, silence. Let's do the next one. Same tone burst, but after that one, you turn it off, and finally it peters out. And what does that look like? The tone burst up, and then it's kind of like this. And then at this point, the next tone burst hits, and the signal jumps up again. So what we're looking at is the difference between how loud the room gets, which is the response curve, and how quiet it gets in between how loud it gets, and that's the running reverb noise floor. Okay. Here's an example made by a strip chart recorder a long time ago. And there. So the upper curve, this one here, is the actual signal is applied to the, it's electronic signal. It's essentially what comes out of the loudspeaker. This is in an empty room. That's what the signal looks like, okay? It's got some at the low frequencies. It's got nothing in the high frequencies, no modulation, 2 dB. It's got 5 dB modulation in the bass, kind of. And that's because the walls are flexible. It's got some windows. And so it leaks bass. And so it doesn't just totally garble in. But that's what a bare room looks like. A good room, well, here's another version of that. There's electronic signal, clean. Remember, it's dB versus time. Here's the a little bit of noise. It's about a 15 dB to noise ratio, but you can see the noise between the bursts. Oh, this one, the next one, is the same burst rate, but now the room is making a lot of noise, and you can see the sound level variations are getting little, and the room is, the variations in loudness are smearing together. This is an awful room, the one at the bottom, and again, remember, it's getting the same burst rate, but what do you hear? You hear, it's just garbled together. So all the notes are garbled together. So this dynamic distortion of a hi-fi room is associated with music being blurred together. Someone's playing a rapid scale and piano, and they're going up and down the piano. And certain frequency ranges of the scale, the notes quit being distinguishable, and they just blur together. Well, that's objectionable, and everyone heard the notes. It's not like you didn't hear the notes. It's that they were blurred together. And so dynamic distortion is what is going on in the playback room. It's not that you can't hear the note. You heard the note. Speaker played it, you heard it, the room's full of it. The problem is when the note stops, the room continues to resound and that note, and you continue hearing the note. You don't hear the dynamics of that note. So dynamic distortion is what the noise, self-induced noise floor is in a listening room. Okay, and what fixes that is acoustics. But let's take a look at something else. The musical clarity is defined in a concert hall. In a concert hall, if you have, you make a balloon pop, and then you listen to the decay. And so you, in a recording, so you pop a balloon, and then you listen to the decay, and it's very loud, and then slowly gets quieter and 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 quieter. If you look at the dB of that, it pops up and then drops out. Okay. So musical clarity, according to the definition of it, is the sound level in the first 50 milliseconds. So the total sound level in the first 50 milliseconds, this might be it. And then the sound level, total energy after that, which might be averaged out as something like that. And the difference between the sound, the reverberation of the sound in the first 50 milliseconds to the 50 and beyond, that ratio is basically a measure of clarity, musical clarity. And so they want to have, 5 dB is kind of okay, better than nothing, 10, 15 dB between these two in order to have good musical clarity. maybe 15 is way too high. Maybe it's around 5 dB in order to have reasonable musical clarity. Okay, what is the mat test? This is not going on. In a small room, this is required a diffusive sound field. In other words, the sound is made, and now you're listening to the reverberant, high, mid, high, low, mids, highs, reverberated, reflected, diffusive decay of sound. And that's what this is all about. So you have to have a big room in order to have a full bandwidth diffusive decay of sound. In a small room, what do you have? Okay. In a small room, let's take it here's a small room. dB frequency. In a small room, in a big room, you might have this. In a small room, you'll have modes. So in here somewhere, it goes from modes, which is not diffusive, to diffusive. And basically there's a range where that takes place, and that's called the Schroeder frequency. And so that defines in here the problem with Schroeder frequency in small rooms. It's at 700 hertz. In that range, between 200 and 700 or something like that. This is that range, but it's in the range of 500 to 700 hertz. So below that, it's not diffusive, and the subject of musical clarity isn't defined. So it's hard to use a concert hall formula for small room acoustics. Let's go back to what are we doing? The tone burst hits, it lasts 62 milliseconds. Here's 50. Almost. And then it turns off. And it off for 62 milliseconds. And then it turns on again. What we're looking at, this is the sound level when it's on, and this is the reverberant noise floor left over when it turned off. We're looking at the signal level difference between those two. And we don't care. We're not, but basically, the clarity measurement, you could have had C, is basically the signal decaying out, and the clarity test is saying, okay, what we're doing is we're adding the direct plus early reflections into here, and then we're just looking at the later reflections in here. So the direct plus early reflections actually builds like that. That's how early reflections go. And so now we're looking at the difference, because the early reflections sound just like the direct signal, and they add together and increase the loudness in the human perception of sound. And so we look at the difference between the direct plus early reflections to the late reflections, and that's the signal ratio. And so that's called the dB modulation. Okay. So let's talk about what causes the sound, particularly in the bass range, to linger so long in the room. Okay. First, let's look at a picture of a hi-fi room. Speaker, listener. If you go in that room and you clap your hand, you'll hear something. It's going to be it's called a Flutter Echo. Well, a hand clap is like 1,000, 2,000 hertz, way up there in frequency. It's very, very short. And so you can hear the distinct clicks, click, 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 click. So if the speaker made that click, the speaker would, the listener would hear the click, and then they're stuck listening to this flutter echo up in the front of the room. Every time it hits the wall, you hear it over here a few milliseconds later, and back, 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 back. No matter, this could be all absorptive, and this could be all absorptive. As long as you've got that wall there, you've got that flutter echo. This is stored energy. It lasts a long time because it's just bouncing square off the wall surfaces. Perpendicular reflections are not absorbed. Sound that's ricocheting around the room, that's the one that gets absorbed because it's always rubbing on the walls. Perpendicular reflections don't. So this lasts a long time. It's the reflections, floor and ceiling, and side-to-side reflections in the plane of the speaker. Okay. But then we play a low frequency note in our room. And we go like this, boom. It takes time to make a low frequency note, right? You have to, 3 waves, 5 waves, something like that, wavelengths. And the wavelengths are long in time. And so we don't actually get a short snap that we can hear tick, 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 flutter echo, because by the time the tone starts, makes a sound and shuts off, the sound has expanded and hit the wall and is on its way back, and then we turn the speaker off, and it's continuing to go back and forth. So we never really hear the flutter echo of bass and mid-range. We hear the flutter of a snap, but the sound is coming out of the speaker in the mids and bass. And the mids and bass aren't pointed forward, they're pointed sideways as much as forward. Remember what the dispersion pattern on a loudspeaker is? It's cardioid. In the treble, mids and the treble. In the bass, it's spherical. In treble, a small amount of sound is going sideways. In bass, the full amount of sound is going sideways. And in treble, the full amount of sound is going down the room and, at slight off-axis angles, and a much less amount is going sideways. When we clap our hand, we hear the treble version of the flutter echo. When we play a bass note, we don't hear, it's louder, but we don't hear the flutterness of the loud note, of the bass note. But the bass note, instead of going boom, 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 we just have boom, a groan, okay? And the listener hears everything that goes up in the front of the room. They hear everything. And this mid, low, or high frequency, this side-to-side reflection in the front room, that's the one that lasts a long time. That's the one when you have a tone burst, and a tone burst, and a tone burst, and you want to know what is making this noise, this is making that noise. And so when you want to know, what do I do about this, you have to get rid of that. And in order to do that, in high frequencies, you add sound panels. In low frequencies, you add bass traps to the side of the speaker. And then you have the floor-ceiling dimension. And you have to get bass traps on the ceiling and the floor, because those are two parallel surfaces, and the sound's bouncing up and down between them too. So that's this is the source. And when you fix this, nothing else in the room, just this noise floor drops way down, and the rest of the room sounds exactly the same. The problem isn't in the rest of the room. The problem is stored energy at the front of the room in the plane of the speakers. That's dynamic distortion. That's where dynamic distortion in listening rooms or studios comes from. Okay, so that basically covers the topic. Now we can talk about some curiosities. So let me talk about a curiosity. On the electronic side of the world, they're trying to look at, they look at the frequency response of the electronics. And then they've got a noise floor. And then they are looking at the harmonic distortion. It's in here somewhere. There's a bunch of little lines. So this is the first harmonic, this is second harmonic, this is third harmonic, and so on. And if you add them all together, you get total harmonic distortion. But how do you get that stuff? You use a frequency sweep that has got FFT hooked up to it, and it plays this frequency and listens. It plays this frequency and listens for these harmonics, and it plays this frequency and listens for these harmonics. And so it's a fantastic device that can do that. Okay. The other version of that system is so this is the frequency sweep. The other version of that getting the same information is called MultiTone. MultiTone plays a series of tones, low, up a few hertz, up a few hertz, up a few hertz. This is spectrum, dB, and this is frequency. And multitone is a series of tones. So each tone it's a tone burst, because it has a very short time duration. And then there's silence between this tone and this tone. So if you go through the frequency, you say, there's a tone, there's nothing, there's a tone, there's nothing, there's a tone. So, and then when you hit, then you play this spectrum of frequencies, you play it through the equipment all at the same time. If you listen to it, it sounds like, it sounds awful. But that's what it sounds like to me. And but what you get when you look at the output of that in a spectrum analyzer is you get the tones, and then you get this. And what this is the ringing of the harmonic. In other words, this is the note that's applied, and it created this harmonic distortion, and it lingers over a period of time. And that's the first harmonic. The second one would be here, the third one would be here, and they all linger, over time. So this is the frequency, this is the signal applied, in other words, and that gets through the equipment, and that's the frequency response curve. And this is buried in there is the harmonic distortion. And of course, down here is the noise floor. And this requires time. Whoop. This one's all, and it's all done. So, I don't know if it's important or not, but this is a faster test than that. Okay. So those are two tests that are used on the electronic side of the front of the speaker, okay? On the acoustic side, let's check back, and what got us information about the running noise floor and eventually the modulation of sound in the room is a gated sine sweep. Gated sine sweep. Let's see now. A sine sweep looks like this. Boo, boo. Right, here's frequency. And it gets to some frequency, rolls off. And so this is dB. And since the frequency is proportional to the time, so this is also time, 0, 30 seconds. Okay, so it goes boop. At 30 seconds it stops. So that's the times frequency sweep. A gated frequency sweep sounds like this. It actually doesn't exist It's not a continuous frequency sweep. Boop, 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 boop. So what's happening is the sound level is tone comes up, it's played, then it gets quiet. Then the tone comes up and it's played, then it gets quiet. Then the tone comes up, it's played, and it gets quiet. The tone comes up and it's played, and it gets quiet. So now this is a frequency sweep. But what is this? This is just like the multitone, a series of tones. And even more, where do we see the noise problem? Well, we can't see the noise problem when the tone's applied. We see the noise problem between the tones. So the gated sweep gives us a sweep multitone test. How cool is that? At any rate, it's just an aside, but I wanted to kind of mention that, and that the same kind of test is used on the acoustic side as used on the electronic side. So that should give us a little reassurance that it's a reasonable test. So in the real world, what we have is the ASC version of that test is the frequency dB, and this is the frequency. So I've got two things on this axis, and this is time. And so the signal goes, over time, the signal goes whoop, whoop. So why did we do that? Well, in the beginning, we did it because we were thinking that when it's going up, we have a low frequency sound generating a tone that's filling in the space. When we get to that same tone over here, it's the high frequency sound, right? That's the tone. It's the high frequency filling this space. And we thought there might be a difference between how the low frequency filled the space of noise and how the high frequency filled the space of noise. And so the response curves are very up and down are very symmetrical, but you can actually see differences. And so the high frequency has a different residual noise floor than the low frequency. It has a different noise floor. So that's where that's where the two curves are different. But in general, it's very similar. The gated test is so this is, remember, this is frequency. So time and frequency, as time goes forward, it's linear with frequency. So this is 20 hertz, and over here is 40 hertz. Over here is 80 hertz. Oh, I made a mistake. 20, 40, 60, 80, whatever. And the idea, in other words, it's linear. It goes up the same amount over the same amount of time. In the normal frequency response curve, this is a log. And so octaves are evenly marked off, but the log, and dB. But when we do low frequency work, it's always linear. And the reason for that is because this might be 20, but this one here is 200. And this one here is 2,000. And this one here is 20,000. We want to look at 20 to 200 or 20 to 400 or something like that. But the low frequencies are spread apart, and the higher frequencies are all bunched together. And it just doesn't work when it comes to working with low frequencies and modes, because modes are always a multiple of the fundamental frequency. So they're proportional to frequency and proportional to time. So low frequencies are always, testing is always done in a linear scale. At any rate, so that's another fine point. here's a tone burst. It builds, and this is the electronic version of the tone burst. It's what came out of the speaker. What the listener hears is, way over here, is the edge rises, it comes across, but the sound starts getting louder and louder and louder, and then it shuts off, and then the sound gets quieter and quieter and quieter. And then there's a new tone burst, okay? So this is the electronic version, and this is the heard version. These are all the early reflections and reverberation that's building up in the front of the room, coming off of the walls and floor and ceiling, adds signal. You have the direct signal, and then this might be, 6 dB, here's a direct, and by the time you add all the reflections up, you might have plus 6 dB. What this is the reflections. This is made up, ideally, without worrying about buildup of reverb in the front of the room, without worrying about that. This is just the unwinding of the reflections in the room. So this curve and this curve are very similar. There's a level difference between the two. But when we have reverberation stored in the room, we still have the same buildup of reflections, but this reverberation stored in the front of the room lasts a long time. We end up with a loud, semi-flat decay, and so we're not really listening to the decay of the room reflections. We're listening to the decay of the standing wave, which is not really a standing wave. It could be a mode, or it could be an off frequency. If the mode is 30 hertz, what happens at 31 hertz? Well, the energy's still stored there. What happens at 32? Well, it's still stored there. What happens at 33? It's still stored there. The frequency of the doesn't matter. It's, if it's a mode, fine. If it's a not mode, fine. Either way, it's still stored side to side, bouncing side to side and vertically in the front of the room. Okay. So the takeaways on this is, from my view, is that A, the MAT test, which is what we developed for room acoustics, it is listening to the dynamic distortion of sound in the room. Very important. In other words, will your room fast track the sound level differences in the music? Or is the music blurred together? Another one is that the equipment that's used to detect harmonic distortion in electronic equipment, a rearrangement of that testing protocol of the sweep and the multitone. When you use a gated sweep, you get a sweep/multitone test. So the test on the electronic side is for harmonic distortion is similar to and related to the test on the acoustic side for dynamic distortion. Let me tell you a story. So we run the MAT test in a room, and it goes like this. It's kind of crummy here. It starts getting good, and then it gets real skinny, and then it gets good again, and then it gets real skinny, and it gets good again, and then it gets skinny. This is the same frequency. This is high and 780. And then it reverses. And then it gets kind of good again, and then it goes this way, and then it goes good, 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 and then blah, blah, blah. So here's the center line so this part of the test and this part of the test, they're kind of like a Rorschach, right? They're very similar. So I'm in a room of audio file. And he says, wait a minute. I know that sound, because you can hear this. I mean, this is what he hears when you do a gated sweep. This is what he heard. He said, I know that sound. And he goes to the record rack. Now, you know audiophiles, right? Floor to ceiling records, 30 feet of stored records in racks, floor to ceiling. Might be on, part on one side, part on the other, maybe aisles in the back of the room, but a lot of records. And they know where they all are. And so he goes, pulls the record, how he knows, takes it out, sets it on a platter, gets it go spinning, gets the needle over, drops it down, says, listen. I'm listening. And there's a very fast musical passage, and it goes right through this frequency range. Remember, this is a frequency range of frequency, you know, F1 and F2, right? This is the frequency range where the sound is blurred. The dynamics is blurred. He says, listen. And so I'm listening to the music, and sure enough, we get to that frequency range, and the rapid notes in that frequency playing together in that frequency, one after the other, in that frequency, blurred together, completely lost any sense of what note was being played when. It was just a blur of sound. And so I realized humbly at that we have a test that is an audible test. It's great to listen to because you can hear the nice passages of your room bandwidths, and you can hear the bandwidths where it's garbled, and so on. But the audio file has already got all this information logged in their head in their record collection, and they didn't need me at all. All this is sort of like an organized version of showing them what they already know. Well, in a way, that was good news, because when the engineers test and the golden ears values and the engineer's reading of the data says this is good, this is bad, and the audiophile, who's not reading anything, listening with their ears, their golden ears, they say that's good and that's bad. And when they agree, then you've got a legitimate test. And so, anyway, that's a good thing to remember, that I like to remember it anyway, is that this is not a strange test. It's an audible test, and the audiophile already knows where all those blurred dynamic sections are in his room. Okay, I think that I've covered everything. Thanks a lot.